February 22nd, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Sergeant Eli Hawkins could count the rivets on the Panzer IV's hull. 48 meters, maybe less. Close enough to hear the screech of steel treads grinding stone into powder. Close enough to see the turret swinging toward him like the hand of a clock ticking toward midnight. His 57mm anti-tank gun pointed downward at an angle the manual said would get you killed. But the manual hadn't mentioned what to do when death was already at your doorstep. Before we dive deeper into this impossible moment, if you're fascinated by the untold stories of courage and desperation from World War II, hit that like button and subscribe to stay with us on this journey through history. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the globe. And if this story moves you, share it with someone who appreciates the extraordinary decisions ordinary men made when the world was burning. Eli's hands trembled on the firing lever. His loader, Private Daniel Ruiz, held the armor-piercing round like it might explode in his grip. The air tasted of cordite and fear. One shot, one chance. The Panzer's cannon barrel elevated, searching for its target. In 3 seconds, maybe 4, that cannon would fire and erase them from existence. Eli yanked the lever. The recoil hammered through his bones. Fire erupted from the Panzer's lower hull. The beast shuddered, belched black smoke, and died. And in that exact moment, staring at the burning wreckage through waves of heat and disbelief, Eli Hawkins realized something that would haunt him for decades. Survival wasn't about following the rules. It was about knowing when to break them. 3 weeks earlier, Eli Hawkins had never fired a shot in anger. He was a farm boy from the Appalachian foothills of North Carolina, 24 years old, promoted to sergeant, not because he was loud or aggressive, but because when equipment failed, he fixed it. When men panicked, he didn't. The 57mm M1 anti-tank gun his crew operated was adapted from the British 6-pounder, a respectable weapon on paper. In theory, it could penetrate a German tank's side armor at 400 meters. In practice, most American gunners had never tested that theory against a living, breathing Panzer. Kasserine Pass wasn't supposed to be a bloodbath. It was supposed to be a learning experience, America's first major ground engagement against Germany's vaunted Afrika Korps in North Africa. After landing in Algeria during Operation Torch in November 1942, American forces had pushed eastward into Tunisia, joining British and French allies in a coordinated squeeze against Axis forces. The terrain favored defenders. The Atlas Mountains split Tunisia like a serrated spine, and nestled between rocky ridges sat Kasserine Pass, a narrow corridor barely 2 miles wide. Whoever controlled that pass controlled the flow of men, armor, and supplies across central Tunisia. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood geography like a pianist understands keys. His 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions were battle-hardened veterans of desert warfare, equipped with Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, and the terrifying Tiger Horn, machines that had crushed British armor across North Africa for 2 years. By contrast, American units stationed near Kasserine were inexperienced, poorly coordinated, and scattered across defensive positions that looked solid on maps but collapsed under pressure. Many hadn't fired their weapons in combat. Some had never even seen a German tank except in training photographs. Eli's platoon dug in along the southern edge of the pass on February 20th. The position offered a narrow firing arc down the main road, textbook placement for an ambush. But textbooks assumed you'd have time to retreat if things went sideways. Here, retreat meant abandoning the infantry dug in behind them, riflemen with Garands and machine guns who'd be slaughtered the moment German armor broke through. Eli studied the terrain through binoculars as the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the valley. His father had once told him while hunting deer in those same Appalachian hills, "Sometimes you don't get the perfect shot. Sometimes you just have to make it count." He didn't know it yet, but those words would become his doctrine. The sound arrived before dawn. Distant at first, like summer thunder rolling across ridges. Then closer, unmistakable. The mechanical snarl of diesel engines, the clatter of steel treads chewing earth, the rhythmic clanking of armor plates shifting with each turn of the road. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. Beside him, Ruiz whispered a prayer in Spanish. The waiting was worse than the fear. It stretched time until seconds felt like hours, until every breath became a conscious act of defiance against the paralysis creeping through his limbs. The 1st Panzer IV crested the ridge at 05:47 hours. Desert camouflage paint, low profile, turret scanning methodically like a predator testing the wind. Behind it came another, then 5 more, then a dozen. The entire road below churned with armored fury, dust spiraling into the pale morning sky. These weren't parade ground vehicles. These were combat veterans, scarred by British shells, repainted and refitted and hungry for American blood. They moved with mechanical confidence, unhurried, deliberate, as if they knew the green troops ahead didn't stand a chance. Eli crouched behind the gun shield, adjusting the sight picture. Training doctrine said engage at 300 meters minimum, preferably from a flanking position where you could hit the thinner side armor. Frontal shots against a Panzer IV's sloped hull were suicide. The rounds would ricochet like stones off water. But the Panzers weren't presenting their flanks. They were advancing in column formation, frontal plates angled toward the American positions, turrets traversing in slow, confident arcs. Eli's finger hovered near the trigger. Wait, his instinct screamed. Wait for the angle. Wait for the moment. 300 meters to their left, another American anti-tank position broke discipline and fired early. The shell struck a Panzer's frontal plate and ricocheted skyward with a metallic shriek. For half a heartbeat, the German column froze. Then every turret swiveled toward the source of fire. High explosive shells rained down on the ridge, detonating in bursts of flame and shrapnel that ripped through rock and flesh. A radio operator tumbled down the slope, screaming. Tracer rounds from German machine guns stitched patterns of death across the hillside. The air thickened with smoke, dust, and the copper stench of blood. Eli's position hadn't been spotted yet. He forced himself to breathe, to think, to calculate. One Panzer had broken from the main column, angling left up a side slope toward their gun. It was hunting them, turret traversing, searching for targets. 70 meters. 60. The range closed like a noose tightening around a throat. At 50 meters, Eli could see the commander's hatch, the spare track links bolted to the hull, the exhaust vents belching black smoke. He could see the machine gun mounted beside the main cannon, the antenna whipping in the wind. He could see everything except a way out. The textbook answer was retreat. Fall back, reposition, engage from a better angle. But retreating meant exposing the infantry behind them. It meant abandoning the pass. It meant letting the Panzer roll through unopposed to slaughter the men huddled in foxholes with rifles that couldn't scratch its paint. Eli looked at Ruiz. The kid was 19, terrified, gripping the next shell like a lifeline. Load, armor-piercing, Eli said quietly. Ruiz's eyes widened. Sir, we can't hit it from this angle. Eli adjusted the gun's elevation, cranking the barrel downward until it nearly kissed the dirt. We're about to find out. Standard doctrine for the 57 mm M1 anti-tank gun specified a depression limit of -5 degrees, barely enough to engage targets on a downward slope. Any steeper, and the gun carriage couldn't compensate. The barrel would strike the ground before achieving proper trajectory. But Eli wasn't aiming for proper trajectory. He was aiming for survival. The Panzer climbed the uneven slope, angling slightly as its left tread sought purchase on loose scree. That tiny shift exposed a sliver of thinner armor beneath the hull, just behind the front road wheel. Not much, maybe 40 millimeters instead of 50. Maybe enough. 48 meters separated the muzzle from the target. At that range, there was no room for error, no time for a second shot, no chance to adjust windage or elevation. The Panzer's turret locked onto their position. Eli could see the gunner's periscope gleaming in the early light, could imagine the German inside cranking the traverse wheel, centering the crosshairs, preparing to fire. His mind calculated trajectories he'd learned in training, armor penetration charts he'd memorized, weak points instructors had circled in grainy photographs. But all that knowledge collapsed into a single, primal imperative. Shoot, now, or die. He yanked the firing lever. The gun roared. Recoil slammed through the carriage, kicking up a cloud of dust and smoke that momentarily blinded him. The shell crossed the distance in a fraction of a second, a blur of hardened steel traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It struck the Panzer's lower hull just behind the left tread, precisely where the armor was thinnest, where the angle of impact was steep enough to defeat the slope. The shell punched through, detonated inside the crew compartment, and turned the tank's interior into a blast furnace. The Panzer shuddered. Black smoke jetted from every seam and hatch. Orange flame licked through a rupture in the side hull, spreading like wildfire through spilled fuel and hydraulic fluid. The engine coughed, sputtered, died. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a hatch flew open. A crewman scrambled out, uniform smoldering, face blackened with soot. He collapsed in the dirt, crawling away from the inferno. Another man emerged, rolling to extinguish flames consuming his jacket. A third staggered upright, waving a white cloth. Surrender. The beast was dead. Eli's hands wouldn't release the gun. His ears rang from the blast, a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything except his own heartbeat. Ruiz stared at him, mouth open, words failing. Around them, American riflemen who'd ducked behind rocks during the exchange slowly emerged, eyes wide with disbelief. One soldier let out a low whistle. Another clapped Ruiz on the shoulder. For a long moment, no one spoke to Eli. They just stared at the burning Panzer, at the smoke spiraling into the sky, at the impossible thing they'd just witnessed. The radio crackled. Eagle 3, confirm visual on burning armor. Say again, did you take that shot? Eli clicked the handset with trembling fingers. Confirmed. Direct hit. Target neutralized. Range 50 meters. Static. Then, Jesus Christ. The reply wasn't military protocol. It was human shock, respect, and fear wrapped into two words. Across the American line, other crews had tried and failed to stop German armor at close range. Their positions had been overrun, guns crushed under treads, crews slaughtered. But not this time. This time, one green American sergeant with a gun that wasn't supposed to work at that range had done the impossible. Eli climbed down from the gun platform, legs shaking so badly he nearly fell. The ground felt foreign beneath his boots, as if reality had shifted 2 degrees off-center and nothing would ever align properly again. The Panzer still burned, metal creaking and hissing as it cooled. He watched the German crewmen surrender, watched medics rush forward to treat their burns. These weren't monsters. They were boys, maybe younger than Ruiz, who'd been inside that steel coffin because someone in Berlin told them to fight, and Eli had ended their war with a single shell. He didn't feel heroic. He felt numb, hollowed out, like a bell that had been struck too hard and was still vibrating with the impact. Around him, the battle continued. Distant explosions, the chatter of machine guns, the rumble of more tanks somewhere beyond the ridge. But in this small pocket of the pass, for these few men clustered around a smoking wreck, the war had paused. They'd survived, not through superior tactics or better equipment, but through desperation, geometry, and a willingness to fire when every instinct screamed to run. A lieutenant from Battalion Intelligence arrived 2 hours later, clipboard in hand, asking questions Eli barely heard. "Describe the shot," the officer said. Eli recounted it plainly. Distance, angle, target point. The lieutenant's eyebrow arched. 50 meters from a depressed position, he repeated. You realize that's not doctrinally feasible. Eli shrugged, too exhausted for diplomacy. It was that, or die by doctrine. The officer had no response. He just wrote it down and walked away. But the story spread, first through the company, whispered over cold rations and cigarettes, then through the battalion, embellished with each retelling until it became legend. A lone gun crew, pinned in a hopeless position, firing at point-blank range with a suicidal angle, knocking out a Panzer with a single shot. It didn't matter that it had only happened once, that a dozen other American guns had been destroyed that same morning. What mattered was possibility. If one crew could do it, maybe others could too. If the 57 brilliance could kill at 50 meters, maybe the Germans weren't invincible after all. The Battle of Kasserine Pass ended in disaster for American forces. Over the next 3 days, Rommel's offensive shattered the Green American line, forcing a retreat of more than 60 miles. Nearly 3,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. Over 180 tanks destroyed or abandoned, along with countless trucks, half-tracks, and artillery pieces. But scattered among the wreckage were stories like Eli's, small, desperate stands where courage had held the line just long enough. Those stories mattered. They became the foundation upon which the American military rebuilt itself. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of Allied forces in North Africa, ordered immediate reforms after Kasserine. Commanders who'd frozen under pressure were relieved. Units were retrained by British combat veterans who'd fought Rommel for 2 years. Tactical manuals were rewritten. Anti-tank crews, once treated as passive defenders, were transformed into hunters. Aggressive, mobile, trained to exploit terrain and initiative rather than waiting for the perfect shot. The lessons written in blood at Kasserine became doctrine written in ink at training camps across North Africa. Eli never asked to be a symbol. But when division headquarters learned about his shot, they pulled him from the line and sent him to a training camp near Beja in northwestern Tunisia. There, standing before rows of nervous recruits who'd never heard a shot fired in anger, he taught what no manual could: how to aim when your hands won't stop shaking, when to break the rules, when to fire through fear instead of waiting for courage. He drew diagrams in dirt, described shot angles, listed weak points on Panzer hulls. But what the men really leaned forward to hear were the truths between the tactics. "How close was it?" a private asked during one session. 48 meters, Eli said. "Could have hit it with a rock." The men laughed nervously. "You weren't scared?" another asked. Eli shook his head. "I was terrified. That's how I knew I was still alive." The laughter died. They understood then. Fear wasn't weakness. Fear was the warning bell that proved you were human. The question wasn't whether you'd be afraid. The question was what you'd do while afraid. By late March, the American military had transformed. At El Guetar, they used prepared defenses and coordinated artillery to repel a German armored assault, knocking out over 30 tanks. At Hill 609, infantry and tank destroyers worked in concert to seize a strategic ridge that had seemed impregnable. The soldiers who'd fled in panic at Kasserine now advanced with grim determination. They'd learned the hard way that German tanks could burn, that Panzers had weak points, that survival required aggression instead of caution. And men like Eli Hawkins had shown them how. Eli returned to the front in April as Allied forces launched their final offensive toward Tunis. This time, the Americans didn't break. They pushed forward through minefields and artillery barrages, street by street, hill by hill, until on May 13, 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Over 275,000 German and Italian troops laid down their arms in what Churchill called a new Stalingrad. The war in Africa was over. Eli had survived it all. They awarded him the Bronze Star for his actions at Kasserine. Eli never wore it, never mentioned it, never told the story unless pressed. When someone brought it up, he'd shake his head and say, "That was just one shot. The war had 1,000,000 more." But something inside him had changed. He'd entered Tunisia as a quiet, uncertain farm boy with a head full of theory. He left as something harder, sharper, a man who understood what war truly demanded. Not perfection, not fearlessness, just the willingness to act when the moment came, to aim through shaking hands, to fire when every calculation said you'd fail. After North Africa, Eli was offered a safer staff position. He declined. "I'll go where they need gunners," he said. He fought through Sicily, Italy, France, seeing more panzers burn, more men fall. In 1983, he returned to Kasserine Pass. Standing on that same hillside, now silent except for wind through scrub brush, a younger veteran asked, "Were you scared?" Eli gazed across the valley. "Every second," he said quietly. "But fear isn't the enemy. It's proof you're still human. The question is whether you'll take the shot anyway." Eli Hawkins died in 1997 in those same North Carolina hills where he'd learned to hunt. He never sought fame, but his legacy endured in every gunner who learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's pulling the trigger while your heart hammers and your hands shake.